You'll get the most out of this video by watching the entire thing first, without stopping and without playing guitar. Then go back and figure out things on guitar. At the end of the lesson, we'll talk about how to practice this information, and most of this stuff compounds, so it's definitely better to watch the whole thing first to get an idea of where we're going. A skeleton key is a key that can unlock multiple locks. At some point in your guitar playing journey, usually after learning a few dozen songs, you can start to recognize patterns. And you might also feel like you're repeatedly figuring certain things out over and over again. Or you might be wondering how some musicians know 100 or even 300 songs. You find yourself repeatedly looking up information on every song, asking, how do I play this chord? How do I memorize this part of the song that has a bunch of different chords? What key is this in? What scale should be played over this chord? What arpeggio can be played over this chord? Are there really 1,000 different chords? And what about improvising? Do I need a new scale for each chord? Are arpeggios something completely different? How do we apply improv ideas from one song over dozens of others? At this point in your journey, when this is happening, it can be helpful to start replacing a lot of the things you've been memorizing with concepts that address all of these things at once. Just like a skeleton key can open many doors at once. With a skeleton key in hand, we can spend more time learning songs and playing music, and less time relearning the same things over and over again. That's what we're going to do in this lesson. First, this is not a perfect adherence to music theory. This is just how I interpret things, and my goal is to make things as simple as possible for the music that I play, which is improvised music. Once you learn this stuff, the exact details will make a lot more sense and can be found in many places. We first need to untangle these concepts that might seem like separate things: scales, chords, arpeggios, chord function, and harmony. Chords come from scales. Arpeggios are the notes of chords played individually, so we can say arpeggios therefore come from scales. Harmony is the simultaneous combination of two or more notes, creating chords and progressions. Chords come from scales, and so does harmony. See where this is going? Scales are the core of our skeleton key. And we don't even have to think of scales in terms of the key on guitar. While we should be able to do this, most of the time it's easier to just think of intervals. All right, let's take a look here at intervals. An interval is the distance between two notes, and regardless of where it's played on the instrument, the interval name is always the same. So this is another huge part of our skeleton key. By thinking in intervals, we can reduce a lot of the stuff we do from 12 variations and various keys down to just one system, which is intervals. So for example, instead of thinking this goes from C to G, or this goes from F to C, those two things are the same distances. We can just say this goes from the root to the 5. And now that covers both cases as well as all the other keys. I encourage you to start thinking in intervals like this. It's really helpful, and it will help to start to consolidate all of this information that we're talking about. So let's just look at the interval distances here. One fret, which is also a semitone or a half step, is called a minor second. And that doesn't have to be from the root to the flat second. It can be from the 3 to the 4. If we went from 3 to 4, that's a minor second. Or from 5 to flat 6 is also a minor second. So just try to remember that regardless of key, intervals behave the same. The next one is going 2 frets. That's called a major second. And we have minor third, major third. The fourth is called a perfect fourth. It does not have a flat version or minor version. Similarly, the fifth is called a perfect fifth and does not have a flat version or minor version. This one is called a diminished fifth, and it's because we're altering the perfect fifth. We'll simplify this here in just a second. Flat 6, let me turn these off. Flat 6, or the minor 6, then we have the major 6, the minor 7, the major 7, and then you're back at the root again. Now, something that's important to know, one, we only need to remember the names within one octave. It just repeats after that. So I can think of it as root 2, 3, 6, 7 have minor and major, perfect 4 and 5 have a diminished fifth between them. So let me just say that again. You have the root, then the 2s, the 3s, the 6s, and the 7s all go minor major. Then you have the 4 and the 5 with the diminished fifth between. So just to say that again, there's the root, the 2, 3, 6, and 7 have minor and major. The perfect fourth and fifth have that diminished fifth between them. That diminished fifth, that interval is sometimes also called a tritone. One other thing I want to point out here is that it is the distance in pitch. So when we go root to the third, say like a major third, it would be the same if we went from root to this third on the A string, or from, say, this root to this 3 on the high E string. Those are also an interval of a major third. Part of that you can understand from the fact that your guitar is tuned in fourths, meaning that each string is a fourth apart except for the G and the B string, which is a major third apart. But you should look at this like it is the strings just keep continuing on and on and on. It's, some people say it's kind of like having 6 pianos. However you want to look at it, the point is that the distances are the same. If you go ahead and play these two notes, a root and a major third apart on one string, it's going to sound the same as playing the root and the major third that is on the next string. Now that we've looked at those, let's talk about, there are some very important interval shapes to remember. Common interval shapes. One is the root to the next root. So when you are playing guitar and look down, any root that you're playing, you want to see this relationship. Obviously, the low E string and the high E string, if you haven't already noticed this, they have all the same notes. Therefore, the intervals are the same. This is also a good one to know, that if you simply go up 2 frets and up 2 strings, you're repeating the root, or what we should call a full octave interval. So it would, again, be the same thing if I went from this 5 to that 5. That is also a full octave interval, right? Because the interval is the distance between 2 notes. It doesn't matter what note it started on. So the next one we want to check out is this. This is the minor third interval. You can ignore this stuff popping up on the screen. It's just in some graphic software that I have. So if we go 1, 2, 3 frets to a flat third, now we're playing a flat third interval. Similarly, if you start here and go back to and up to the next string, you're playing a flat third interval. Next is the major third interval. Very similar. We just go 1 more fret, or on this version, it's the next string and back a fret. This stuff that I'm showing right now is extremely important to memorize, but it will make more sense once you go through the entire video. We have some ways to practice this stuff at the end that gives it some context. Whatever you do, don't stop the video and just start practicing this. All right, so next interval would be a fourth, and that's helpful because on all the string sets, it's just the note under the one you're playing is the fourth. Except again on the G and B string, because they're tuned to differently, it has to be up a fret. Perfect fifths look like this. Another very important one to remember is a common relationship between chords is going from the 1 chord to the 5 chord. The minor seventh looks like this, so you can even think of this as, okay, root to the 4th to the flat 7, or minor 7th. And then major 7 looks like this. So that covers the interval distances. I just want to mention one more time, something extremely important to understand is that intervals are distances regardless of the note they start on. The distance from any note up 2 frets is a minor second, not just the distance from root to the 2. The third to the diminished fifth, for example, third to diminished fifth, is also a distance called a major second, because we're going 2 frets, right? Okay. So wrapping up intervals, you might be worried right now thinking I'm about to say the next thing after this is to learn a bunch of scales. Fortunately, we only need to know one scale, which is the major scale. That's because the majority of music is derived from the major scale. Aside from heavy metal and a lot of jazz, most of the stuff that we're playing for improvised music that is going to be a lot of jazz songs still, all the jam band stuff, Grateful Dead, Allman Brothers, all of that stuff, rock music, blues, pop, a lot of these things, most of the stuff you're going to encounter are in the major scale, meaning major keys and the chords, arpeggios, modes that are derived from the major keys. Therefore, we're only going to focus on the major scale. Also, Once you get through all of this stuff with the major scale and you internalize it, if you then want to go and apply the exact same process to, say, the melodic minor scale, which you don't have to because that's only going to show up usually in some jazz music or a few other uncommon, more or less common things, then you can do that and the process will be a lot easier once you've gone through this already. One easy way to think of the notes in the major scale is that it's the chromatic scale with the flat notes. In other words, the minor or diminished intervals removed. I'll say that again. Think of the major scale as this, what we're looking at on the screen, but remove all of the flat notes. Let's turn this off, and there we go. So what's left here is the major scale. So this is another big part of the skeleton key. This shape can be moved around just like the chromatic shape can, right? And what I mean by that is I can take this chromatic shape. Right now the root is on F. If I needed it to be somewhere else, I can just move it. That's the great thing about the guitar. And I can do the same thing with this major scale. If we need the root somewhere else, then we can move it to wherever we want it to be. The R is the root note. That's the key of the scale. And you can see these relationships we just talked about. Removing those notes doesn't change it. The major third would be this. Root to the fourth would be this. Root to the fifth. And the major seventh. Since we removed the flats, we're not seeing the minor seventh or the minor third in these right now. Now, ultimately, the goal here is to look down at the neck and see this image overlaying the neck when you're thinking major scale. Now, that's a lot of information, and if you just try to brute force this and memorize the whole thing without any context or patterns to it, it's probably going to be fairly difficult. So guitarists have devised a few ways to view this information. The two most common are called caged and 3 NPS. That stands for 3 notes per string. All right, caged has 5 patterns, and it's called caged because each pattern has a common chord shape within it. Here we'll start with the E shape pattern, and I'm starting there because that has the commonly found bar chord E in here. In this case, you would be barring the first fret. The blue circles only show the actual notes that would ring out. Of course, when you're barring, it's not even playing 3 of those notes that are on the bar. But that's why it's called the E-shape pattern. It's movable, as are all the other patterns. Then we have the D-shape pattern, which is called that because it has a D chord in it. Usually we play this in the open position and omit that note that's on the D string. It would just be played open. Then we have the C-shape pattern. It, of course, contains a C chord. Again, that's an open position chord where we would omit the note that's being played here on the G string. We have the A-shape pattern. Usually played in open position. We omit this note played on the A string. And then lastly, we have the G-shape pattern. And again, we have 3 notes here that we would omit when played in the open position. These patterns all overlay with each other like this. And we'll talk about it when we get into practice at the end, but one of the big objectives for the skeleton key is to internalize these patterns and to know the interval names in the pattern. So for example, starting in the E shape, the red circles are all the roots. So this would be the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 root again. And when we play that, we want to say this out loud until it's internalized and until we start seeing those interval relationships that we talked about. Root to root, root to fifth, root to fourth, root to major third, root to major 7, and so on. And we want to see these start to get these interval shapes in our head. The stronger that we can relate these interval shapes and how they overlay any one of these patterns, the better we are going to be at improvising, because this is the information that we're going to constantly recall to give context to harmony and the melody that overlays harmony, and all of that stuff overlays these shapes. 3 NPS takes 3 notes per string and would do like this: root, second, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, root, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, root, 2, 3, 4. If you do that starting on each note and then start the same thing, 3 notes per string starting on the second note, 3 notes per string starting on the third note, you wind up with 7 patterns. If you do a search for 3 NPS shapes, you can find those pretty easily. Some people like to argue about which one is better. It's best to know both and then to know none of them, because you see what's on the screen. Once you've internalized one way, it's fairly trivial to internalize the other. And it's good to learn both too, because it offers different ways to move around the neck. 3 NPS is great because you can play pretty fast stuff when you know that it's always going to be 3 notes per string if you want to do runs like that. It also helps when you're starting with your index finger. Say your index finger is on the root and you want to go up the scale, then it's pretty easy to do that. Caged is great for visualizing triads, bar chords, playing certain arpeggio shapes, etc. So in general, if you encounter that frequent internet argument about should you learn caged or 3 notes per string, realize that you are probably reading some garbage. At some point, the 2 patterns just start blending together. So since our goal is improvising, we want to be able to have freedom to do what we want and not be limited to thinking in specific patterns. And these 2 are just 2 ways to get to that freedom. So as you practice your scales, remember that it's critical to know the interval names and to see the common interval shapes. This will make your scale shape practice infinitely more powerful than just knowing the shape alone. And I can't stress this enough again, and we'll talk about it more when we get to the practice section, but it is far more important when you're practicing these patterns that you remember and learn these interval names that are on here. These are called your diatonic intervals, meaning it's the 7-note scale. These are the notes that belong to the key: root, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. None of them are flattened. And you want to say those when you're practicing your scales. You want to say them when you're practicing your chords, and to memorize them, because that is the core of the skeleton key, is to memorize that stuff. If you just learn the shapes without that information on it, let me turn it off for a second, then you're just learning something like this. And that's not very helpful. So let's turn this cage back on, or major scale back on, and start talking about a little bit about how we can derive chords from scales. Okay, before we jump into the chords, I'm going to also have this piano keyboard on the screen so that we can look at that at the same time. One thing that makes the guitar difficult is that pitches exist in multiple places. So for example, this note is C. The same pitch also exists on the A string. And you know, if you go far enough up the neck, you can find the same pitches 5 or maybe 6 times across the strings, whereas piano only has a pitch one time. This pitch of C only exists here. This pitch of C is an octave higher. You don't get duplicates. It's just a linear thing. That makes it easier to see the information. I have not shown the accidentals that are on this. They would look like this. Just a quick recap of notes, which you should already know. C sharp and D flat are called enharmonic. They're the same thing. Which one we use depends on the key of the song. If you don't know about this, look up some stuff on the circle of fifths, and that can tell you a lot about figuring out how many sharps or flats are in various keys. But the purpose of this entire lesson is we're coming up with a skeleton key based on intervals so that we don't have to use that specific information. I think a better way to look at it is you should know how to do all of this stuff with intervals before getting into the keys. That way you have one skeleton key for doing everything. And if you don't have that and you're just using the keys, then you're trying to do at least 12 different ways of memorizing all of this information. So take everything we have, multiply by 12, and your brain explodes. So if we take our whole major scale formula, that goes whole step, then another whole step, then a half step, then a whole step, a whole step, a whole step, and a half step. And if we start in C, you see the same thing. One key to the next, like this, equals the same thing as moving one fret at a time. So if we went whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. That's all the white keys. So in the key of C, there are no accidentals at all. And it can be easier to analyze this stuff in the key of C. However, eventually you should do this in all of the keys. You'll see what I'm talking about in a second when we start lighting these notes up. Now let's talk about how we actually get our chords out of the major scale. The important thing here to understand is that the major scale has 7 chords that belong to the scale. Those 7 chords each have a function where they are either consonant and kind of stay in place, or they are dissonant and they want to resolve to another chord. So again, there's 7 chords in the major scale. This is important because in songs that are in major keys, like we talked about, that's most of the songs out there, the songs are made up of some combination of the chords that belong to the scale. So if we know what those chords are and how we can derive those chords and what we can play over them, then we can improvise a lot of stuff over these songs more easily. The way that the chords are derived is through a process called stacking diatonic thirds. And in simpler terms, that just means that you start on a note, you skip the next diatonic note, and then you play the next one. You skip the next diatonic note and play the next one. So diatonic thirds would be going from this note to this one, 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 etc. We're just skipping every other note. So if we did that with the first chord, it would look like this. So let's talk about one other thing, which is what these labels 1, 3, and 5 mean. We have now switched our context to thinking about chords. We are not naming the diatonic notes of the scale. On our 1 chord, which is what this is, it does match the notes of the scale because we are starting the chord on the root of the scale. That is why it's called the 1 chord. You can see on the piano, it does the same thing. It just skips the diatonic note and goes to the next one. So I mentioned earlier that interval shapes were important, and we should know that this shape between these 2 notes is a major third, and this shape between these 2 notes, if we go up 1, 2, 3 frets, is a minor third. So this chord can be thought of as we are taking a major third and stacking a minor third on top of it. This is also the interval distance listed. So if we went from the 1 to here, that is a major third. If we went from the 1 to here, that is a major fifth. And that's the way we will think about the rest of these chords. Now, when we do this, 1, 3, 5 like this, or root 3, 5, same thing, we get a major triad. Triad just means that it's a chord made up of the 3 notes, the 3 diatonic notes, root 3, 5, or some version of those, which we'll see in a second. Let's go to the next chord. All right, so this is the same process. We've now started on the 2nd note of the scale. And again, we're thinking chords, not scale. And so we're going to name the intervals that we have. This distance is a flat third. This distance from the 1 is a 5. Okay, the distance between these 2 is a minor third. The distance between these 2, that shape again, just like we did here, is a major third. So if we take a look at what this is called, when we have a flat 3 and a 5, that is a minor triad. That's the only difference. To get a minor triad, you can think of it as a major triad with the third made flat. Okay, that is our 2 chord, and it is usually spelled with a lowercase Roman numeral to represent minor. So we now have 2 chords that belong to our key, the 1 chord and the minor 2 chord. One thing that I'll try to state again is that these chords are always in the same order. Again, this is key agnostic. It's a skeleton key. If we moved from the key of C to F or B flat or anything else, this process is going to be the same. The triads are going to be the same. Everything else we derive from it is going to be the same. Let's go ahead and look at the 3 chord. So we're starting on the 3rd note of the scale, skipping, doing a diatonic third, skipping the next one, which is a diatonic third. And then if we name our intervals from here to here is a minor third. Flat 3, from here to here, this shape is our fifth interval shape. So this is the 5. Again, we're thinking chord, not scale. So we're redoing the interval names on each chord. This distance is a minor third. This distance is a fifth. The distance between the flat third and the fifth is a major third. This chord, 1 flat 3 5, is another minor chord, another minor triad. It's the 3 chord, and we write it like this. That's our 3 chord. Let's look at the next one, which is going to be the 4. And we start on the 4th note, skip, 3, skip, and we have our 5. And as you know now, that's a major triad. That's our 4 chord. We write capital Roman numeral to represent that it's major. Again, if we look at the interval relationships on their own, this would be a major third and this would be a minor third. So let's look at that. The distance from root to 3 is major third. The distance from 3 to 5 is minor third. A minor triad reverses that. The distance between root and flat 3 is a minor third. The distance between flat 3 and 5 is a major third. But really the only thing we need to be concerned with this is the fact that from 1 to 3 here, that's a major third, and from 1 to 5, we get the perfect fifth. All right, let's look at the 5 chord. So we start on the 5, skip a note, get a 3, skip a note, get a 5. And our 5 chord is just another major triad. Let's do our 6 chord. We would start on the 6th note, skip a note, we get a flat third. That's the distance between these two. Skip a note, and the distance between these is a perfect fifth. 1 flat 3 5 is a minor, and that is what our 6th chord in the major key will always be a minor chord. All right, let's do our last chord. This is starting on the 7. 1 flat 3, and this is new, flat 5. You see this interval shape goes to a flat third or a minor third, and this shape, again, going from the flat 3 to the flat 5, is also another minor third. If we went from the 1 to the flat 5, that's our diminished 5th shape. This gives us a triad called a diminished chord, and we would call that the diminished 7th. The triad spelling would look like this: root, flat 3, flat 5. Ignore the minor 7 flat 5 for now. We'll get into that in just a second. So there's something very important to realize here, that regardless of our key, if we are in a major key, then the chords are major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminished 7th. And there's 2 important things I want you to realize here. Is there is a pair of minor chords, the 2 and the 3, that are next to each other. There are no other pairs of minor chords next to each other. The 4 and the 5 is the pair of major chords that is next to each other, and there are no other pairs of major chords next to each other. This is really important because when you start analyzing songs and trying to figure out keys and what chords resolve, which we'll get into later, this is one of the easiest ways to see it. For example, if you look at a song and see a pair of major chords that are a whole step apart, like C and D or F and G, that's a pretty good indication that you're looking at the 4 and the 5 chords of a key. Now, let's take this entire process one step further here. And what we're going to do is add another diatonic third. So we'll go 1, 2, 3, and add a 4th note. Let's see what that looks like if we do that. Okay? So you can see it on the piano. We're still in the key of C, just skipping whole steps. We've gone 1, skip, 3, skip, 5, skip, 7. We know that this relationship is a major 7th. And what this does is it adds this 7th note, this major 7. And when we play a chord like that, the chord is called major 7. And as you'll see here over the next minute or so, by adding the 7th interval, whether it's going to be major or minor 7th, to each chord, we have a new set of chords that is not called triads, it's called 7th chords. Let's go ahead and do the next one real quick. 2 chord, we skip a note and add this, and that interval related to the root would be a flat 7. And if we go to our minor chord and add a flat 7, this is how you spell a minor 7 chord. Of course, the third chord, which is a minor, is going to do the same thing. Except I have that in the wrong spot. It should be here. Of course, the 3 chord, which is minor, is going to wind up being a minor 7 as well. Same thing. We have this relationship. Here's the 1, the 4, and the flat 7. This distance is a 5th. This distance is a minor 3rd. This distance is a minor 7 or flat 7. The next chord is the 4 chord. Add the 7. And there's that major 7th relationship again. Our 4 chord is major. We have a major 7 chord. The 5 chord will be interesting. Okay, this is something new. We have 1, 3, 5, and then this distance is a minor 3rd. This relationship between the 1 and this note makes it a minor 7th, a flat 7th. So what is it when we have 1 major 3rd in a flat 7? This is a very special chord called a dominant chord that has, it looks like a major 7, but the 7th is flat, a minor 7th interval. One thing to notice here is this relationship between the 3 and the flat 7 and what that shape makes. That interval shape is our diminished 5th shape. It's also called a tritone. It creates a lot of tension. And because it creates a lot of tension, this dominant chord is one of our tension chords. So remember that. The 5 chord is one of our tension chords in that it wants to resolve. Specifically, it wants to resolve back to the 1 chord. So when we see a 5 chord in a piece of music, a lot of the times it's going to be followed by something with even more tension, like a 5 with more tension notes in it. But eventually it's going to want to resolve to the 1. Most often you're just going to see a 5 chord resolve to a 1 chord. What that says about improvising is that we could do something that is pretty dissonant sounding over the 5 chord and then come up with something pretty to resolve it to the 1 chord. Let's move on to the next one here. This is our 6 chord. We add in this note as a flat 7th. Don't get tripped up on the B string shape here. Remember that the B string is shifted because all the strings are tuned as perfect fourths except the G and the B are tuned as a major 3rd. So we get a shift. But you need to learn the interval relationships between how your strings are to the B string as well. This, of course, 1 flat 3 5 flat 7 is a minor 7th chord. And last but not least, we have our 7th chord and we add in that flat 7. Now we have 1 flat 3 flat 5 flat 7. I said earlier to ignore this term minor 7 flat 5. Now we're going to talk about that. Root flat 3 5 flat 7. So the reason it's called minor 7 flat 5 is we basically have a minor 7 chord, except the 5th is flat, and we get this. If we went ahead and made this 7 flat again, we would get a fully diminished 7th chord. Some people call the minor 7 flat 5 chord a half diminished chord for this reason, because it does not have the 7 flatted twice. But when we derive chords in the way that we've looked at here, most people think of this chord as a minor 7 flat 5 and then this as a diminished 7th, fully diminished. These diminished chords, fully diminished chords, do not come from the major scale, and so we're not going to look at them in that context right now. They can be related to the major scale, but they're not derived from it using the methods we just did. Let's look at something here with these chords again, because this gives us a kind of easy way to play these. This 1 and the flat 5 create the tritone relationship, and that makes this another tension chord. So we have 2 tension chords. We have the 5 chord is a tension chord, and the 7 chord is a tension chord. The 5 wants to resolve down to the 1. The 7 wants to resolve up to the 1. Those are the two common movements that we see. Now, what I wanted to look at here is how we can step through these. This is the only thing that you need to remember to get a ton of improv firepower out of. We have major 7, root 3, 5, 7. To make this dominant, you just flat the 7, root 3, 5, flat 7. To make that minor, you flat the 3rd, root flat 3, 5, flat 7. And then to get to our minor 7, flat 5, we flat the 5. And that gives us how to play all of the chords that belong to a major key. All right. So if we look at our neck again with all of the chromatic notes on it, we can now start to apply this information in a lot of ways. And this is our skeleton key. Once you internalize what we've covered so far, we can take the stuff we already know, like bar chords, and do a lot of new things. Let's start with an open E chord. And actually what we'll do, let's take this and move it into the key of E like this. So the open string would be the root E, right? It's a little bit easier to see here. So this is an open E chord. Now, since you have the nut of the guitar and you don't need to fret the open strings, you could probably just ignore these root notes and the 5th interval. And then you should recognize that you have this E shape, which is made up of a 5, the root, and the 3. And the open strings you're playing are the root and another 5. And that should be recognized as being your major triad, root 3, 5. Okay? Anywhere you want to play a root 3, 5 with E, you can obviously see on the neck there's a dozen other places to be able to play something like that. Here's an open C chord. Again, you have a root, a 3. This 2 is a mistake. It should be here. The 5, the root, and the 3. And that's your open C chord. Again, root 3, 5 is a major triad. So I'm just showing you here that these open chords that you've probably known for a very long time, you're just playing triads. Triad does not mean 3 notes only under your fingers. Triad means that there are 3 distinct note names. In this case, it's the root, the 3, and the 5. It doesn't matter how many times you play the root, the 3, and the 5. And a lot of times it doesn't make sense either to double them up. Like in this chord, it has 2 roots and 2 thirds. There are a lot of cases where that might not be the best sounding option to play. It just depends on context. So let's move this to, we're going to put the root note on G now. Hopefully that works. Look at our open G chord. Yep. Root 3, 5, root 3, root. So in this case, we're playing the root 3 times. We are playing the 3rd 2 times and the 5 once. So again, you know, there are cases where you want to hear this kind of sound. There are other cases where you don't want to hear the root 3 times. For example, if you're playing with somebody else who's also playing a G chord, it may not be necessary to hammer home the fact 3 times plus whatever they're playing that the root of the chord is G. Add in a bass player who's holding down the G, and then you're probably stepping on their feet to be playing the root so many times. So there are other options for playing the chord. Just as well, you could take these out, and that is also a G triad still, right? We still have our root 3 and 5 here, and that is perfectly fine to play that as a G triad. You can come up with any combination of these that you want to. Let's see, let's find another one. That's a G triad too, right? That's also a G triad. And you can play these further down the neck as well. So if you just know that it's root 3, 5, to play a major triad, you know your interval relationships that we talked about at the beginning. And you can see this in your cage patterns. Then you can play any of the triads that are available. Major, minor, diminished. We'll look at more of that in a second. So maybe a little more interesting, let's take a look at a bar chord. So you've seen this bar chord shape. This is root on the 6th string, the bass string here. And here we have root, 5, root, 3, 5, root. So again, we're playing the root 3 times. We're playing the 5 twice, the 3 once. In music, the 3 of a chord and the seventh of a chord are the most important chord tones. And here's why. If you look down here again, it's the third that determines whether the chord is major or minor, correct? So you notice that the major chord has a major third. The dominant chord, which is also major, if it were just triad, has a major third. The other three, which are minor chords, have flat threes in them. So it's very important when you're trying to communicate what the quality of the chord is by playing it, and you want someone else to hear the quality of that chord, that the third stands out, whether it's a third or a flat third. Similarly, the seventh is also an important note. One, because it leads up to the root, it leads the ear up to the root, but also it too determines whether a chord sounds major or minor or dominant. But in the case of the roots, they're always just the root. In the case of the fifth, they're always just the fifth 99% of the time, unless you encounter some diminished stuff, which is very uncommon. So the reason I'm saying this is with this chord where we are hammering home the root note 3 different times and the fifth 2 different times, that stuff is really eclipsing the third. Is that the right word? Eclipsing? It's taking over the third. Let's look at some things we can do with this, though, now that we know our intervals, we know these spellings, right? So if we want to have a G major 7 chord, then in this shape, we need to add the 7th. So what's the easiest way to do that? Let's just do this. We take our root, we move it down to the 7. So again, that's G major bar chord. Take the root and just move it down. This is another one of these skeleton key things that when you know how this kind of stuff works, you don't need to look up chords nearly as much anymore. If you encounter a major 7 chord and you understand the only difference between a major triad and a major 7 chord is that the major 7 interval is added, then you can easily see too that that is the only thing we're doing, is moving this root note down to the major 7, like that. Similarly, how can we go and get a dominant 7 chord? We just need a flat 7 interval. So take this one. Now we are moving the 7 to a flat 7, and that is our dominant chord. The beauty in knowing this is that you can quickly come up with these chords on the fly once this stuff is internalized. It doesn't matter that this is G7. It would be the same shape for A7 or B flat 7 or whatever else. And also, these intervals are in the same order. If I move this thing up to a B flat, it's still root 5, flat 7, 3, 5 root. It's still a dominant chord. It's still the same shapes inside of it. It's still the same arpeggios. It's still the same scale that would be used over it. And that's the important thing, is it consolidates all of that information. Whereas if you don't know that, then what we all start out doing in the beginning is we see a G7, we look that up. Then somewhere down the road, we encounter a B flat 7, we look that up. Then we encounter an F7, we look that up. Then after some time, we realize, okay, these shapes are movable. But then it may not occur until later that, okay, also these shapes come from a scale, they have arpeggios tied to them, et cetera, and all of that stuff is movable too. And in fact, if we just know this stuff about how the chords are created and have that internalized, then we can just create these chords on the fly. And I'm just showing a really basic example here. There are multiple ways to play a G7 chord. All you need to do is start on a G, the root note, and find its 3, 5, and flat 7 intervals from that root note, and then you're playing a dominant chord. So if we wanted to make this a minor 7 chord, what do we need? We've already got a root and a 5 and a flat 7. We just need a flat 3. So take the 3 and flatten it, right? So we're taking that note and flattening it. Now we have a G minor 7 chord. If we wanted to say make it a G minor triad, we could do that. So I just took the flat 7 and moved it back up to the root. We don't need a flat 7 in a minor triad. We just need root 3, 5, and that's that shape. Which kind of brings us back to this conversation again about not needing to double the roots and the 5s and all of that stuff so much. If you really want to have a balanced chord sound, it would make sense to play each note in the chord one time. So instead of playing a minor 7th chord like this, you could do one like this. We have root, flat 7, flat 3, 5. As soon as I learned this and heard the sound of it, I stopped doing it this way anymore. Because here I'm doubling the 5, I'm doubling the root. The important chord tones are the flat 7 and the flat 3, so I'm burying those sounds. And this is much cleaner. It's also easier to play. And if you bar the flat 3, flat 7, and 5 with your ring finger, then you can do some other movements more easily. So let's talk about something called extensions real quick. The term doesn't need to sound too scary, but when we move above this octave, right? So we've gone from the chord root through all the notes, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7, root here is our octave again. Then we can continue the numbering from there. So if we said 7, 8, the 2 would be 9. The 3s would be 10. The 4 would be 11. I've got that written down here. And the 6 would be 13. So the 2 is a 9, 4 is 11, 6 is 13. You can just remember that. And here's kind of the point of it, is that these extensions let us add another flavor to the existing chord. It doesn't change how the chord functions. It's just, think of it like adding a melody note onto the top of the chord. So for example, if I wanted to play a G minor 9, let's say that would be this. Okay, I'm taking the second, which is the 9th, and putting it on top of a minor 7 chord, which now makes it be called a minor 9th chord. All right. Similarly, I could do something like this. What would that be? We have our minor 7 chord, and then we're adding the 4th interval, which is the 11th. So this is a minor 11 chord now. Of course, we wouldn't be playing this 5 anymore. We would play it like that. It is fine to eliminate the 5s out of chords. All the 5 does is it reinforces the root. And it's actually fine too to even eliminate the root out of the chord, because usually the 3 and the 7 are going to imply what that is. All right, let's look at another version of this. We had our dominant chord that we looked at, right? Doubling up the root, doubling up the 5. We could reduce that and play it like this. Now we only have one of each of those. Perfectly viable dominant chord right there to play that instead of all of this. So we're just removing that 5th off the A string and the duplicate root that's on the E string. And instead we're just doing this. So let's do an extension on this. Let's add in this 6 here, which would look like that, right? Take out that 5th. Again, it's fine to remove the 5. So now what do we have? We took a dominant chord and put the 6 on top, which is the 13. So this would be called, instead of G7, we would call this G13. And you can continue to do this. Really, there's a billion combinations of it, but knowing how this works gives you access to it rather than going to a chord dictionary every time you encounter a chord. The point is that works for a while, but eventually, going back to the idea of this, if you want to learn 100 songs or 300 songs and you want to start memorizing this stuff and kind of making sense of it, this is a method for doing that. If you're going to a chord dictionary, your brain eventually is going to run out of memory. I, for one, cannot memorize that much stuff, and I think memorizing hundreds and hundreds of chord shapes is a very difficult thing to do. So this G13 is good too. Again, I want to comment that the extensions do not change the function of the chord, right? So a dominant chord would be spelled something like G7, A7, B flat 7. If we make it G9, B flat 9, A9, or A13 or C13, those are still just dominant chords. You've just added some melodic flavor to the top of it. Same goes for the major 7. You can play a major 9. Minor 7, you can play a minor 11. They're still just major and minor chords. All right, so here's the next thing to move up to is let's talk about triads. At this point, we have gone over the interval names, the common interval shapes that you can play on guitar and move around that are key agnostic. And we've also talked about the cage positions and where the triads come from. So now let's get into a system of actually playing triads across the neck. If you've already memorized the information we talked about so far, you actually don't even need this because all of it's right here and you can see where the triads are. But it does help to have a little system of organization, and we have 2 ways that we can visualize these. One is going across the neck horizontally, and the other is playing vertically in each position. So for vertically, you can see here, take this position, for example.
you have root 3 5, 3 5 root, 5 root 3, root 3 5. And you should also probably recognize that these triads are the same chords that the cage shape is based off of. For example, this would be the A shape, this one would be the E shape, and so on. The other system going horizontally, we base off of what we call string sets. String sets is just a set of strings. So since triads has 3 notes, there are going to be 4 string sets. So string set 1, 2, 3, that's named after the string names 1, 2, and 3. 2, 3, 4, that's our second one. 3, 4, 5 is our third. And 4, 5, 6 is our fourth and last string set. So let's look at these triads. First, we'll talk about this new term, inversion. This is very simple. An inversion simply means that we're changing the order. So in the root inversion, which happens to be here based on our key, it might be somewhere else based on a different key, the triad starts on the root. That's why it's called root inversion. And it goes in order root 3 5, as you see here. The next inversion is called the first inversion, and we took the root, we moved it to the top being the highest pitch, and now we have 3 5 root. If we did this again and moved the 3 to the top now, then we would have 5 root 3, creating our second inversion. If the neck was infinite in either direction, and this applies to going vertically too, the order is always going to repeat: root, first inversion, second inversion, root inversion, first inversion, second inversion, root inversion, first inversion, and so on. Now there's a few other triads that we can look at. The next one would be minor. And rather than trying to memorize minor as a completely separate thing, let's use the information that we already have, where the only difference between the major and minor triad is we make the third flat. So if we did that, it would look like this. In each case, we've made the third flat, and now we have our minor triads. The inversions obviously stay the same, as the root has not moved, the 5 has not moved. Now, how would we make these diminished? Of course, we flat the 5. So in this case, the 5 is flat for each one. So this is just more skeleton key information. Because we know where these notes come from, we know how to define the triads, it is not necessary to go in and memorize these as completely new information. Let's look at this on the next string set. So going to the next string set, if we just repeated the same process, here we have a root inversion, root 3 5, first inversion, 3 5 root, second inversion, 5 root 3. These are in the same order again, the notes are in the same order. We're just doing it on the string set of strings 2, 3, and 4. Next string set, second inversion, 5 root 3, root 3 5, 3 5 root. We have second inversion, root inversion, first inversion. If we kept going, we'd have second again, then root, then first, and so on. Lastly, we have this string set where we start on first inversion, 3 5 root, 5 root 3, and root inversion, root 3 5. And again, we can go horizontally. So if we started here and I click back through these, just focus on this one for now. You can play this and it will add to it. Root 3 5. 3 5 root, first inversion. So we went root, first inversion, of course, second inversion, 5 root 3. Root inversion will be next, root 3 5. And that's really it for triads. You now have access to all of the triads across the neck in a simple system where you really only need to memorize initially the major triads. Then you can derive your other ones from that. If you approach your practice this way and look at the neck and actually think about the intervals and derive the information, that information is going to be a lot more sticky and will become internalized a lot faster, especially when you start applying the same thing to actual songs that you know, which we'll get into later. All right, so let's get two subsets of the major scale real quick, or derive two things from the major scale that are very simple, and that's the major and minor pentatonic scale. Right now on the screen, we are looking at the major scale across the neck. Hopefully you can see where the cage patterns lie, if that's what you're using, or 3 NPS, or whatever method it is. But we know that this is
the major scale. To play a major pentatonic scale, the only thing we have to do is remove the 4th and 7th from the major scale. Notice here that the notes are not moving. All we're doing is removing notes. And so then the major pentatonic has 5 notes: root, 2, 3, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then it repeats across the entire neck. You can use this over any major chords. It's nice because it includes our chord tones. You should be able to see a lot of the triad stuff that we did already in here. Root, 3, 5. Root, 3, 5. Right? 5, root, 3. We know that's the second inversion. 5, root, 3, triad. Root, 3, 5. That's a root inversion triad. We can go on 5, root, 3. That's a second inversion. Where's one that starts on a 3? Here we go. 3, 5, root. That's our first inversion triad. So all the triads are on here for the major triads. And this is a pretty simple way to think about the major pentatonic scale. You can use this over any major chords that you want to. So the next one then would be the minor pentatonic scale. So all we're going to do is shift this root down by a major third interval, meaning we're going to start on the 6 and then rename the intervals. The reason we start on the 6 is because, as we already learned, the 6th chord is a minor chord in the major scale, and we can use the minor pentatonic to play over minor chords. That's just one of the options for playing over minor chords. So if we moved it all down and renamed everything, we get this. Again, the shapes did not change. The scale was still just sitting here. This is what I mean when I say everything can be derived out of this scale, out of a parent scale, is what we're looking at with the major scale. So in this case, if we renamed our intervals, let's just go through it from this root. We know from here to here is a minor third. We know this is a perfect 4th. This is our perfect 5th shape. This is our minor 7th shape, and then the octave. So the minor scale is root, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 7, root. And of course, we have all our minor triads in it. Here's root, flat 3, 5. That would be the root inversion minor triad. Flat 3, 5, root is our first inversion. And then if we did 5, root, flat 3, that is going to be the second inversion, and so on. We have all of our minor triads sitting inside of the pentatonic minor scale. So hopefully seeing both of these, that you have your triads sitting in here, which they're also, of course, sitting inside of the major scale, means that you can do some more interesting things now with your playing. If you pull up a song and say it has a minor chord in it, then you could play a riff using some of your minor notes, and you could also play a triad for that minor chord, or you could arpeggiate the minor chord as well. Now we're going to talk about 2 different topics related to harmony. One is tonal harmony and the other is modal harmony. And I will show you a little bit about the modes here in just a moment, and how we, with the information we already know, this major scale, that the 7 modes are also included in this pattern. But before we jump into the modes, we need to understand a little bit about 2 types of harmony. And again, they are tonal harmony and modal harmony. An improviser needs to know if a song is tonal or modal because it changes the job completely. In a tonal tune, you're outlining harmonic movement, especially the pull from 5 to 1. Your phrasing, note choices, and tension all revolve around chord resolution. In a modal tune, there is no harmonic pull. You're not aiming for resolution. You're building texture, exploring color, and sitting inside a single sound. Knowing which one you're in tells you whether to navigate changes or dig into space. What tonal harmony means, basically, is that there are chords that have a function. And that is what this graphic is showing. We touched on it earlier about what chord function is. It's basically that our 7 chord, this diminished 7, and our 5 chord, the dominant chord, resolve. And so to simplify what we're looking at on this chart, just focus on this big arrow at the bottom, that when these chords are played and they resolve back to the 1, we are looking at something that has tonal harmony. Now in modal harmony, we don't find these resolutions. Modes are focused on a tonal center. It can be a note that is the root of any chord, and the duration of the chord is typically played for longer, and the mode focuses on that tonal center. So for example, if we decided let's use the 2 chord for a while, then we would play a mode related to the 2 chord and just stay there. The only thing you need to grasp from this right now is that tonal harmony has resolutions coming from these dominant functioning chords that go back to the one. And we'll look at some examples of actual music that uses this tonal harmony as well. The only thing to take away from the modes is that it does not have these resolutions. It's a static thing that is more focused on tonal centers and scales, not chords. All right, let's talk about the circle of fifths. We don't need to do this to memorize all the keys, even though that information is in there. A lot of information is too. I would encourage you to look it up and read about it. But we're going to spot something that is very useful. Does the song resolve? Meaning, is the song tonal harmony, not modal harmony? More likely, it won't be the entire song these days, but it would be maybe a part of the song that we're trying to find out, is this tonal harmony or not? So if a song has a dominant chord that pulls back to the one chord, that's a sign that it's tonal. This circle helps us to see this quickly. If you spot a chord that's one step clockwise from the other, like G to C or D to G, you're looking at a 5-to-1 movement. That is resolution, that is tonal. If you don't see that kind of motion, the song or progression might not be tonal at all. It might be modal, sitting on a single chord, or a sound without resolving. So we can use this circle not just to find key signatures, but to check, is there a tension and release, or is the song floating? It is not terribly difficult to remember the circle of fifths and to be able to count in fifths. Again, we're going counterclockwise, and the way that I've memorized it is to see this pattern. We have C, F, and then the word bead, which is all flats. That's helpful to remember. Then there's a G flat. Then there's that word bead again. And then G, and then C. We're back at the top again. So if you can just remember C, F, bead, G, which are all flats, then bead, G, which are not flats, then you've got the circle. All right, let's talk a little bit here about modes. And the modes derive from the major scale. We're looking at the same thing that we've basically been looking at the entire time. The yellow or orange circles are the notes of the major scale. All of the intervals are listed. This is in the key of F. You can see here we have a root on F, and this would be the E position, E shape of caged. And so all the modes are, this is going to be very similar to how we derived our triads, is you start your root on a note and then derive all your intervals in the scale. Then you can move the root up to the next note in the scale and derive all the intervals again. So you can do that 7 times until you're back at the octave. That gives us 7 modes. After we go through this, I'll show you an easier way to, or a different way to kind of get this under your fingers on the guitar. So let's go ahead and look at the first one. And the first one is what we've already been looking at. The first mode is called Ionian. Ionian is the same as the major scale. As you can see, the intervals here are the root, the major second, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, major seventh, and the octave. So we'll do what we said and go ahead and shift this up to the next note, which would be this one. So again, we're basing this off the key of F. So remember that this was our starting root. Then we have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I'll just keep shifting it that way. So we'll shift this up. We get our second mode, which is called Dorian. And if we look at the intervals now, it's root, major second, minor third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, minor 7, root. And this mode is minor because of the flat 3, right? It always works the same. The flat 3 determines the chord, the quality, and so we could play Dorian over minor chords. It also has a flat 7, just like the minor 7 chord. We have those intervals of the minor 7 chord in here, the 1, flat 3, 5, and flat 7. All right, let's go ahead and move this up to the next note. And here we are, still in the key of F, deriving these modes. So this one is called Phrygian. We have root, minor second, minor third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, minor 6, minor 7, root. Kind of easy to remember this one because it's all minors except for the things that can't be, the root, perfect fourth, and perfect fifth. Phrygian, again, we have the minor third, so that's a minor chord scale that we can play. Let's move it up again, get the fourth one right here. That is called Lydian. And here we have the root, major second, major third, and then the diminished fifth, which typically when people write Lydian, they call the sharp fourth. Those two notes are in harmonic.
And we have the perfect fifth, perfect sixth, perfect seven. So another way to think of this, Lydian is major because it has the third. And another way to think of it is this is just the major scale with a sharp 4. Now let's move that up and get the next one. This one's also an easy one to remember, as it's just the major scale, the flat 7, which is also a certain chord. 1, 3, 5, flat 7 is our dominant chord. So some people call this the dominant scale. Mixolydian mode means the same thing, great for playing over dominant chords. From its root here, we would have root, major second, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, flat 7, or minor 7, and the root again. All right, let's move up again. I guess we're going to run out of room here and need to go backwards. All right. This one is called Alien, also known as natural minor. This is just like Dorian, except the 6 is flat. We have a root, major second, minor third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, minor 6, minor 7, root. And then since I'm running out of room here, I'm going to run this back to what we had here. And hopefully you understand that this would have been the same as moving up to the 7 here. It's the same thing if I had done this. And that gives us our last mode, starting on the 7th degree of the scale. So what I should have done actually is this, not start on F, we're starting on the 7. So the F is 1. So we have this one, which is root, minor second, minor third, perfect fourth, diminished fifth, minor 6, minor 7, root. You can see that written here. And with 1, flat 3, flat 5, flat 7, that of course is a diminished chord. And this can be used over diminished chords. All right, so now we know how we derive the intervals that are in each mode. And as you saw, all we're doing is shifting the root note. So another way to think of it that you'll commonly hear is that we're just playing the major scale and changing the root note. So if we play the major scale, remember this pattern that we've been looking at the entire time has not shifted. We're simply renaming intervals by starting off a different place. So another way to think of this is in the key of F, if the root is F and we play these notes, then we're playing Ionian. If we start on 2 and make that the root, but we don't change the pattern, we're playing Dorian. If we play the same pattern and start on 3, we're playing Phrygian, etc. And so you could move this to any other key. You could go move up and have, say, A as your key or your root for Ionian. So if A was the major scale, then B would be the note Dorian starts on. C sharp would be the note that Phrygian starts on, etc. Now, a quick rant on the modes. I personally feel like these are over-taught in a lot of guitar curriculum, mostly because of what we've talked about with tonal and modal harmony. What you often see in guitar teaching is where people are teaching that modes are positions of a major scale or positions on the fretboard. And modes are not positions. Modes simply represent a tonal center in modal music, which is music that does not have the resolving 5 going back to a 1. So while it's not a position, it can be helpful to think of it that, okay, if I start here and play through this scale this way, that would be Ionian. If I start here and play this shape, then that would be Dorian. If I start on the 3 and play through this shape, that's Phrygian. If I start on the 4 and play through this shape, that's Lydian. And that is correct. But it's important to realize that if I'm starting on the 4 and playing through these notes, while that could be considered Lydian, I can start on any 4, such as this one. This is the 4th of the key of F, and play through it, and that would also be Lydian. And that's just the Lydian shape. What really determines if something is that mode or not is the harmony, the chord that lies under it. And we've got those chords listed here. So if there is a major chord being played, you could play Lydian over that major chord, especially if the chord was preceded by a minor chord here. That would be a half step away, right? Root, 2, 3. See, this would be the minor chord root. This would be the major chord root. So if you were going between these two chords and playing this as a minor chord and this is a major chord and that's your vamp back and forth, then you could think Lydian and play that over that entire vamp if you wanted to. Some of the ones that we frequently see are the 5 chord going to the 4 chord, right? So if we were playing
for example, was this F, G, A? So let's say we rewrite it like this, just to represent each of the chords. Here's our 1 chord, our 2 chord, our 3 chord, 4, 5, 6, 7. If we played those as triads, it would be a major, a minor, a minor, a major, a major, a minor, and a diminished. If we played them as 7 chords, it would be major 7, minor 7, minor 7, major 7, dominant 5. That's our dominant chord, a minor 7, and then a half diminished, or what's more frequently known as a minor 7 flat 5. And we already went through how to get those. So some of the common modal chord progressions you'll see are vamps are going between the 5 and the 4. So if the chord progression was going between the 5 chord and the 4 chord, so here I guess that would be C, 7, and B flat, major 7. Or you could just think C to B flat if you wanted to do triad. So if the chord progression was C to B flat, again, that's the only place where there is major chords a whole step apart in our major scale. And so that would imply that, okay, this is a mixolydian thing because it's starting on the 5 chord. It's going to the 4 chord. It just goes back and forth. It never resolves to the 1. So that would be a modal thing to play mixolydian over. If it were going the other direction, we would probably think Lydian since it's starting on the 4 and implies that that's more the focus. So 4 to 5, that would be B flat chord to a C chord. Again, whole step apart. The only place where we have a whole step apart is the 4 and the 5 chord, which is Lydian and mixolydian. So similarly, we have a whole step apart between the 2 and the 3. So if this was being played as, G minor to A minor, and that was the chord progression, then we would think Dorian. Just a couple notes on these modes. The major scale is obviously the most common one that is used. Out of the minor options, Dorian is the most common used for minor chords. It has a smoother sound with this whole step between the 5 and the 6 than the alien natural minor does with this flatted 6. So you will usually see people playing in, or hear people playing in Dorian a lot more than natural minor. Mixolydian is the third most common, as that's for the dominant chord. So that covers the 3 chords. You don't have to really mess with the others that much if you don't want to. You've got your major scale, Dorian as a minor chord option, and Mixolydian as a dominant chord option. Sometimes you will hear songs in Lydian. The Reba Jam and Fish uses that, where the chord progression is E flat major 7 up to F. Those are 2 major chords, a whole step apart, which tells us that it would be the 4 and the 5 chords. So Lydian would be played there. If you play Lydian over a progression like that, it has a really uplifting sound. Phrygian and Alien are not used nearly as much, and Locrian is rarely used, as there usually are not too many songs where diminished is being used in a modal sense, and it almost always diminished is used to resolve, which means then it's tonal music. The only other thing that I'll mention on this is with using modes in tonal music, which a lot of guitar players think of it that way, it's not necessarily wrong. I just find it more difficult. For example, one of the more common chord progressions out there is called a 2-5-1 progression, right? And as we have talked about a lot here, 5 resolving to 1 means tonal music. So if we were playing the chords 2-5-1, which is tonal and has resolution, you could just think major scale, or better yet, think arpeggios, triads, that sort of stuff, which we've already been playing. Play the arpeggio of 2, the arpeggio of 5, the arpeggio of 1, then you're playing the chord tones, and it will outline that harmonic movement and that resolution, which is exactly what we want to do in tonal music, is to give that sense of resolving. A lot of players will say play Dorian on the 2 and Mixolydian on the 5 and Ionian on the 1. That just, to me, seems more complicated. It's an abstraction. It's including a lot of notes that are not the chord tones. And in a progression like this, where it's probably played 2, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? 2 chord for a measure, 5 chord for a measure, 1 chord for 2 measures, or even twice as quickly as that. It's simply not sitting on the chords long enough to really hear anything modal. All right, the next thing to talk about is how to actually start implementing all of this stuff. The reason to practice this stuff is so that it becomes internalized. When you can recall it as easily as your phone number, then you can use it to improvise music. Needless to say, music is in real time, so this info isn't very useful if you have to think about it or look it up. I've found it's easiest to retain these things by doing them for just 10 to 20 minutes per day consistently, and then immediately apply the concepts to the songs and material you work on during the rest of practice. So again, that's 10 to 20 minutes of working just on this stuff by itself, and then immediate application to real songs. The application is what gives it context and makes it stick. Probably the worst way to learn it, at least for me, has been to work on it for a few hours by itself and then rarely apply it to songs. This approach is sort of hoping osmosis takes over and doesn't work very well. For me, at least, it leads to burnout and I stop learning it altogether. So what we want to do is look at this stuff in order of the video, and I would suggest maybe starting with this list, and you can expand on this list as you progress through things, and just go through as much as you can in the 10 to 20 minutes. So for example, the very first thing that we talked about was the major scale and the caged positions. If you don't know all of those, then work on that for 10 to 20 minutes until it's internalized. Maybe you can add in playing your triad arpeggios, as that will make it stick a little bit better. But don't jump around, don't jump ahead into modes if you still don't know those positions. So here's what we have. We can pick a cage pattern and we'll do everything in that pattern. Play the pattern while saying the interval names. Play the chromatic scale that is under the pattern. Now play each arpeggio starting on each note of the pattern. Start at the root and say the interval names as you go. It's just stacking thirds, skipping every other diatonic note. This is easier if you memorize the chord formulas. There's only 4 or 5 of them, and say those as you go. Now move to chords. Using the lowest root in the caged shape, play a full major bar chord. Now make it a major 7, now dominant 7, minor, minor 7, and so on. Name each interval of the chord. That is the most important part with all of this, is that we are relating the interval names to the cage patterns. I'll say it again, the most important part is relating interval names to the patterns. Without that, all we're doing is memorizing a whole lot of different shapes on the guitar with no context. We want the context so that we can actually use it to improvise and have a complete system. Now, using each of the major, minor, and dominant chords, add extensions and name those. Make sure you understand how extensions are named. You can make these up. You can also look them up and name the intervals. Now pick a key. Play the major triads across each string set from the lowest fret on the guitar to the highest and back down. Repeat for minor, diminished, and augmented. Name the intervals of the triad as you go. I cannot stress this enough. This information sticks and compounds when the intervals light up on the neck. The information is far less useful when you just memorize shapes. If you still got time left, go to the next cage shape. Do it again. If you've got all this info down, start trying to do it with the 3-note per string method. And just keep making up other ways to do it and to make this knowledge go deeper.
you